Waging Peace, Global Adventures of a Lifelong Activist by David Hartsough with Joyce Holliday. Chapter 13, Taking the Long View, Active Nonviolence in Palestine and Averting War with Iran. An apartheid wall surrounds and separates the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem from their Israeli neighbors. Electrified chain-link fencing, concertina wire, steel, and concrete barricades stand as grim reminders to Palestinians of their place. In some spots, the wall dissects their villages, separating Palestinians from one another. In 2009, I crossed this barrier and led an interfaith delegation to Palestine and Israel. One of our memorable visits was to Bilin, an agricultural village with about 1,800 residents located in the West Bank, just west of Ramallah. More than half of the villagers' farmland was unreachable because of the separation fence constructed by the Israelis. The Israeli Supreme Court had surprisingly ruled in favor of the Palestinians and ordered that the barrier be moved so that the villagers could get to their fields. But for 2.5 years, members of the Israeli military refused to comply with the ruling, claiming that they could not afford to move the fence. Our delegation joined the weekly demonstration with about 200 local people accompanied by Israelis and other internationals marching from the center of Bilin up a hill to the fence to demand compliance. As we approached the barricade, Israeli soldiers launched dozens of canisters of tear gas. The gas burned our eyes, seared our lungs, and exposed skin, and caused widespread nausea. The attack was much more potent than anything I had ever before experienced. With the frightening explosions of concussion bombs all around us, our delegation turned around abruptly and stumbled blindly over the rocks and back down the hill. The villagers, exposed to this toxic gas every week, continued the nonviolent protest quite close to the fence. Some wore face masks or held plastic bags up to their faces to deter the noxious fumes. A man in a wheelchair stayed the longest, able to leave, but unwilling to surrender his place on the line. Perhaps no other conflict on the globe has seemed so intractable or required such courageous perseverance on the part of peacemakers as the crisis in the Middle East. When I arrived there in 2009, 61 years had passed since my dad had worked in Gaza and Israel, distributing tents, food, and medicines to the Palestinian refugees of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. I found it particularly painful to discover that not only many of those same refugees, but now also their children and grandchildren are still living in refugee camps in the prison called Gaza. The people of Gaza are all but completely cut off from the rest of the world. They cannot travel or visit relatives living beyond the barricade, and family members and friends living outside it cannot visit them. Only very limited food and medicines get through the barrier, and building supplies and many other necessities of life are severely restricted. In December 2008, for more than 3 weeks, the Israeli military had subjected the people of Gaza to horrific violence during Operation Cast Lead. Israeli airstrikes killed more than 1,400 Palestinians. 13 Israelis were killed by rockets shot from Gaza. 5,000 Palestinians were injured and more than 50,000 were left homeless. Thousands of homes and dozens of schools, 700 factories and businesses, 34 clinics and hospitals, 24 mosques, and 10 water and sewage lines were utterly destroyed. On the first anniversary of the siege, 1,340 people from more than 40 countries gathered in Cairo, Egypt for the Gaza Freedom March. We joined them after our time in Israel, Palestine, and planned to cross the Rafah border into Gaza. Unfortunately, under extreme pressure from Israel and the United States, the Egyptian government denied most of the internationals entry into Gaza. Only 90 of us, very fortunate souls, were able to get in. The joy of the Gazans upon seeing those of us who made it, and their awareness that many other supporters were in Egypt in solidarity, was deeply moving. On December 31st, 2009, the day of the Freedom March, I walked with two school teachers. They were greatly touched that people from all over the world cared enough about their fate that we were willing to take on the expense and overcome all the obstacles to get into Gaza to join them. Our international group of 90 joined about 1,000 people from Gaza in a march to the northern Israeli border checkpoint called Erez Crossing to demand that the Israeli government end its occupation and siege of Gaza and let the Palestinians live in freedom and peace. We marched through mile after mile of bombed out homes, factories, and shops. People were everywhere gathering up rubble, recycling rebar, and grinding up smashed blocks to make cement to rebuild their homes and other destroyed buildings. Dressed in long black coats, with their peo curling below broad-brimmed hats, 4 Hasidic Jewish rabbis from Natzarei Karta International, also known as Orthodox Jews United Against Zionism, marched with us. They carried a banner emblazoned with a Palestinian flag and the message, "Judaism demands freedom for Gaza and all Palestine," and wore buttons proclaiming, "A Jew is not a Zionist." The Gazans showed deep gratitude for these Jews who are committed to honoring the humanity of the Palestinian people and had come to march with them. After the march, a few of our group went out with some Gazan fishermen in their small boats. The Israeli authorities forbid them from going beyond 2.5 kilometers from the shore, which means few fish are available to them. Israeli soldiers have shot at those who have strayed beyond the imposed limit. Farmers have similarly been targets of Israeli bullets. Gaza's most fertile land is near the border, and if farmers cultivate too close to the wall that separates Gaza from Israel, Israeli soldiers fire on them. In a refugee camp, our interfaith delegation met a mother racked by grief. On a wall of her small home were pictures of 28 members of her extended family, all killed in the Operation Cast Lead attacks. The cement blocks in the upper part of her home, which had suffered severe damage in the bombings, had been relayed with mud because cement is not allowed into Gaza. Holes in the roof let in the rain. The woman's children, who had nothing to play with, were the delighted recipients of a few of the 50 teddy bears a war veteran, Will Covert from New Mexico, had carried to Palestine. Classes for school children have to be convened in 2 shifts each day to accommodate them all in the few schools that were left standing after the siege. Books and other educational supplies are at a bare minimum. Orphanages are overflowing. Children suffered greatly during the attacks, and the legacy of severe trauma remains. One of the great joys of that trip for me was meeting Dr. Mustafa El-Hawi from Gaza. His father had worked with my dad in a refugee camp in Rafah in 1949. Following in his father's footsteps, Mustafa works for an NGO, non-governmental organization, called Community Bridge Initiative, providing both humanitarian relief and training in conflict resolution, peacemaking, and active nonviolence. The NGOs in Gaza feel pressure not only from the Israelis, but also from Hamas, the party of the elected Palestinian government. Members of a women's NGO, non-governmental organization, told us that because of their affiliation with Fatah, the other main political party, they are often harassed and sometimes arrested. Other groups reported being closely watched. In the Middle East, the fact that people who have been oppressed often end up being oppressors is abundantly evident. This is the cycle of suffering in which that embattled land has been locked for more than 6 decades. Israelis who experienced the horrors of the Holocaust are now oppressing Palestinians, cashing an essentially blank check from the United States to purchase their bullets and bombs. And members of Hamas, who have suffered decades of injustice from Israelis, are turning their anger against their own people. The Palestinians are caught in a vice of violence, pressing them from both sides. Endless checkpoints, 26-foot-high walls, and great fear and mistrust between most Israelis and Palestinians are grimly persistent features of life in Palestine. But I discovered there that violence is not the whole story. An alternative to the cycles of destruction is also being forged on both sides. A larger story is unfolding beyond the script of retaliatory violence, a story of a growing nonviolent movement that both Palestinians and Israelis are building. Weekly nonviolent demonstrations, like the one in Belen, have been held in many Palestinian villages for years. Israelis, including combatants for peace and anarchists against the wall, and internationals, including Christian peacemaker teams, ecumenical accompaniment program, and Michigan peace teams, actively participate in these weekly actions. Occasionally, protesters can claim success. In February 2010, after 5 years of nonviolent actions in Belen, Israeli bulldozers finally began to move the barrier. But such changes have come at a great cost. On July 28, 2008, 10-year-old Ahmed Musa was fatally shot by Israeli soldiers during an anti-barrier demonstration in Nilin, 4 miles west of Belen. On March 13, 2009, US citizen Tristan Anderson of Oakland, California, was critically injured when he was struck in the head by a gas canister fired by an Israeli soldier after the weekly protest had already ended. Tristan's only weapon was the camera he was using to take photographs of the demonstration. When we visited 9 months later, he was still in an Israeli hospital near Tel Aviv, just beginning to talk again and get around in a wheelchair. Other peaceful activists have been killed in these protests, and more than 11,000 Palestinians have been imprisoned for nonviolent resistance. But the deeply inspiring commitment of Palestinians throughout the region to continue the struggle nonviolently, even when Israeli soldiers shoot powerful tear gas canisters and grenades, concussion bombs, rubber-coated steel bullets, and sometimes live ammunition at unarmed villagers, is unwavering. They are deeply committed to al-Samud, which in Arabic means perseverance or steadfastness. Palestinians practice al-Samud daily by refusing to leave, even in the face of heavy intimidation by Israeli military and armed settlers who are trying to confiscate their lands and remove them from their homes. Al-Samud motivates them to replant their olive trees when they are uprooted, to rebuild their homes when they are bulldozed, and to keep walking to school even when Israeli settlers taunt and throw stones at them. The Palestinians are steadfast even when they can't reach their fields, when their homes are raided in the middle of the night, and when members of their families are arrested. In Al-Masara, south of Bethlehem, 75 well-armed Israeli soldiers and 6 military tanks met our peaceful demonstration of approximately 200 villagers, sympathetic Israelis, and international supporters. At the barricade, a former Israeli bomber pilot who had joined the peaceful demonstration spoke passionately against the apartheid wall. A local woman, accompanied by her 2 young children, held up a picture of her older son who had been arrested with her husband and was being held indefinitely with him in an Israeli prison. Her home had been bulldozed by Israeli soldiers. Her anguish was acute, her determination unwavering. After the rally ended, people slowly began walking back down the road to Al-Masara. The soldiers crossed the barbed wire and began aggressively pushing the crowd back toward their village. A couple of young boys threw small stones at them, and they immediately rushed at the boys and shot off sound grenades with blasts that were both deafening and frightening. Backed up by the 6 tanks, which were roaring their engines, jerking forward, and threatening to run down any demonstrators who did not retreat quickly enough, the soldiers attempted to arrest the boys. Sami Awad, executive director of the nonviolent grassroots Holy Land Trust, whose aim is peaceful coexistence between Israelis and Palestinians in Bethlehem, intervened. He told the military commander that security and goodwill would not be served by the arrest of the boys or the army's invasion of the village. Once they concluded their show of force, the troops and tanks retreated from al-Masara and people returned to their homes. Some of our delegation stayed on in the village to offer a protective presence in the event of a return by members of the Israeli military. They didn't come back that night, but a few nights later, soldiers came and arrested one of the leaders of the nonviolent movement. He still sits in an Israeli prison. In the community of Tent of Nations outside Bethlehem, I met Daoud Nassar and his family. Daoud's father bought land in 1924 when the area was under Turkish rule. Now, all the hilltops surrounding the farm are overrun with new settlements, homes to some of the 500,000 Jewish settlers who have moved into the West Bank. Armed Israeli soldiers broke into Daoud's home a few months before our visit and told him that he and his family had to leave, but Daoud refused to go. He has the deed to his home and believes he has a right to stay on the land that has belonged to his family for more than 85 years. Settlers raided his farm and uprooted 400 olive trees, which were the source of most of his family's income. Committed to a nonviolent response, Daoud and his family planted 500 more trees, but these will take many years to mature and produce olives. Israeli authorities refused Daoud's family building permits for their house, the greenhouse where they start new seedlings, and the cistern where they collect rainwater. At any time, the soldiers could come and bulldoze their home, forcing them to leave. Daoud and his family are a remarkable example of al-Samud. Daoud questions, why can't all the children of Abraham, Jews, Muslims, and Christians, understand that the basis of all our religions and religious teachings is the same, that we love one another, that we treat others as we would like them to treat us, and that we are all children of God? I did not observe in him even an ounce of hatred toward the Israeli settlers or soldiers who continually threaten his family with eviction from their ancestral land. Their faith that justice will prevail and that nonviolence is a more powerful weapon than the gun sustains them. Daoud and his family organized camps for young people of all religions from many countries around the world to come and live for a while on their land. The camps provide a wonderful opportunity for these young civilian diplomats to discover how much we human beings all have in common. When the young people return to their home countries, they take the message that building understanding and friendship are important parts of nonviolent social change. They have learned that there are better ways to challenge injustice, oppression, and violence than responding with more violence. While I traveled through Palestine, hearing the stories of people who had been uprooted, many families showed me the keys to their original homes in what is now Israel. They are hanging on to them in the hope that someday they will be able to return to their homes. This may seem a dim and distant possibility, but many people and organizations are at work trying to make it a reality. MEND, Middle East Nonviolence and Democracy, offers nonviolence training to hundreds of young Palestinians throughout the West Bank and East Jerusalem, helping to educate and nurture a new generation with a deep understanding of nonviolent action. The Beyond Center promotes human rights and helps people to address injustices rather than avenge them. The Israeli peace movement is also alive and well. More than 4,000 refusers have disobeyed orders to serve in the illegally occupied territories of the West Bank and Gaza, including 73 pilots who refused to participate in bombing missions. Hundreds of high school students are defying Israel's compulsory military service, 18 months for women and up to 3 years for men. Many of these brave people have served time in prison for their stands. Other groups of Israelis working for peace and justice include New Profile, Rabbis for Human Rights, and the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. Women in Black have been demonstrating in Israel for peace and justice for Palestinians every week for more than 23 years. I was particularly moved by the Israelis and Palestinians who have joined together in groups such as Parents Circle Family Forum, whose members have lost loved ones in the conflict. Recognizing that their shared pain unites them, they're speaking together in schools and to community groups. We refuse to let our grief harden into hatred and actions of retaliation, one of them told me. Instead, we are turning in compassion and reconciliation to each other, Palestinians and Israelis, with the hearts of parents who want to join our voices and hands so that there will be no more bloodshed and no more lives of children wasted. These people, along with a growing number of others, understand that the security of Palestinians and the Israelis is inextricably linked. Such significant interdependence exists between these two peoples in that ancient and holy land that they must work together to find a peaceful resolution to the conflict. As John F. Kennedy once said, "Those who make peaceful change impossible make violent change inevitable." The US support of nonviolent movements in the Middle East would help to make peaceful change possible. Training Palestinian young people in conflict resolution and nonviolence would be a much greater contribution to peace in the region than sending weapons and building walls separating these beautiful people. If we all, Israelis, Palestinians, and Americans, embraced a different way that affirms the rights of all people to live in peace with justice, the whole world would be more secure. Treating all people as children of God and with respect as sisters and brothers is a place to start. That has to include respecting their choices. We in the United States must get clear about whether we really support democracy, or if we support it only when people elect the governments we prefer and pursue the policies that further our self-interest. Former President Jimmy Carter, who headed up the monitoring mission during the 2006 Palestinian elections, declared them honest, fair, and safe. Should the United States and Israel force the Palestinian people to suffer untold misery through our actions because we do not like their elected government? And is the Hamas government really more terrorist than our own, which has been raining bombs and death on the people of Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan? For 15 months during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, our peace community in San Francisco held weekly die-ins in front of the Federal Building to protest the bombings and the use of torture. As we had done during the Vietnam War, we read the names of the war dead. Then everyone who felt called to do so lay down on the sidewalk with a white sheet covering them, as the dead are covered up in Iraq. Our hope was that hundreds of communities across the country would organize similar activities to resist the wars. We also organized die-ins on March 19th of each year, the anniversary of the US military's invasion of Iraq. Iran. Unfortunately, our nation seems to have no shortage of enemies. At the time of this writing, the target of our disdain is Iran, designated the latest threat to world security and enemy number one. In 2009 and 2010, I also led delegations to that country. After all my decades of international travel, I'm still amazed at the similarities in how governments foment mistrust and hatred through relentless propaganda. Not much different from our government's campaign against the Russians when I first visited their country half a century ago. And I'm equally amazed to discover many ordinary citizens in these places who are open and kind and willing to go to extraordinary lengths to make me feel welcome. The Iranian government was mistrustful of our visits, understandable given the history of US-Iran relations. In 1953, the CIA and British intelligence engineered the overthrow of Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, who had nationalized Iran's oil production, enabling the profits to go to programs that benefited the Iranian people. The United States also installed a military general and paved the way for the dictatorial reign of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. In 1979, a popular revolution deposed the Shah, and later that year, militants supporting the revolution took over the US Embassy in Tehran and held 52 Americans hostage for 444 days. In the 1980s, the United States supported Iraq's Saddam Hussein in his invasion of Iran and a war that cost at least 2 million lives. And when US Navy missiles shot down Iran Air Flight 655 in its own airspace in July 1988, killing all 290 people on board, instead of apologizing, the US government awarded a medal to the captain of the ship that fired the missiles. US warnings about Iran are mind-bogglingly hypocritical. Iran has not attacked another country in more than 200 years, which unfortunately cannot be said of the United States. I find it particularly stunning that the only country on earth that has ever used nuclear bombs against a civilian population would denounce Iran's nuclear program and declare as a threat a nation surrounded on all sides by US Army bases in Afghanistan and Iraq and US Navy ships in the Persian Gulf. The George W. Bush administration declared Iran part of the axis of evil. Members of our current government have continued to relate to Iran, a nation whose history reaches back 2,500 years, as if it were a naughty child. The US Congress has voted to spend hundreds of millions of dollars, and the CIA has been put to work in an effort to destabilize, overthrow Iran's government. And the United States, along with many other governments in the international community that have followed suit, has imposed very harsh sanctions that are crippling the Iranian economy and making the lives of ordinary Iranians almost unlivable. Israel and some in the US government continue to threaten to bomb Iran. While our delegation was visiting, the Iranian government kept a close watch on all our movements and refused to allow us to set up many meetings. However, we were able to spend a lot of our time meeting ordinary people in parks and on the streets. And we discovered what I've always discovered in other countries: people refusing to buy into the government propaganda that we are one another's enemies and working to change their government's policies to be more tolerant and understanding of other nations. In Iran, the professors and poets, the mosques and museums often reflect a profound reverence for life. One member of the delegation that traveled to Iran in late February 2009 was Father Louis Vitale, a 77-year-old Franciscan brother who had recently spent 2 years in jail as a result of his protests against US war-making and torture. Louis shared with Muslim leaders that he has kept the Ramadan fast every year since 2001, which moved them deeply. Their conversation harkened back to St. Francis himself, who centuries before, during the Christian Crusades in the Holy Land, offered friendship to the feared and much maligned Sultan and spoke peace to Muslim brothers and sisters. In a park in Esfahan, a man approached me, smiling and pointing at my t-shirt, which bore the phrase, "Peace with Iran," written in both English and Farsi. He said to me, "Thank you for your message. We are all children of God under one sky on the same earth. We need to see ourselves as brothers and sisters and friends, not as Iranians or Americans or Muslims or Christians or enemies." The man's name was Hamid, and he was a firefighter at the Shiraz airport on vacation with his family. His young children drifted toward us from a playground, curious about the American visitor. Hamid continued to talk animatedly, encouraging me to read the Sufi poet Hafez, and gratefully receiving my suggestion that he read Gandhi. He declared at the end of our conversation, "All religions teach us to love one another." As I made my way through a busy bazaar, a man emerged from a shop and asked where I was from. When I told him, he smiled broadly and cried, "Welcome to Iran. We are very glad to have you here. We would like many more people to come visit us from America, but don't bring your guns." Those words still echo in my soul. Don't bring your guns. This is the message that I believe most of the world's people want us Americans to hear, but we just keep on developing ever more sophisticated and lethal weapons to use against other people around the globe. One of the latest horrors is the use of unmanned drones in warfare. At Creech Air Force Base outside Las Vegas, soldiers sit in trailers at video consoles, tracking people in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and then directing drones armed with bombs to kill them. The drones can accurately target a person, but whoever else is in the vicinity also gets killed. It's just one more way we're raising anger across the world and fueling the forces that want to do us in. The military has even announced the prospect of arming drones with nuclear weapons, further escalating the collateral damage. In 2008, I was arrested in one of the first protests against drones, along with my wife, Jan, Louis Vitale, and several other people, including Jean Stoltzfus, the Mennonite friend from my DC lobbying years who had served with International Voluntary Service in Vietnam. We had requested a meeting with the commander at Creech and were denied. When we stepped onto the base sidewalk, soldiers surrounded us. While we were waiting to find out what would happen to us, I asked Gene to tell me about his recent trip to Afghanistan, which meant that the young man guarding us also had to hear the story. I imagine that was the first time this soldier had to listen to the details of the horrific reality on the ground that were the result of the deadly real-life video game he and his comrades were playing. Sadly, Gene, a stalwart of courage and peacemaking, died shortly after that arrest. I feel extraordinarily blessed to have stood with so many people in so many places who are committed to ridding the world of its guns and bringing change nonviolently. Although Peace Workers is a small, low-budget NGO that operates out of my home, we have found ways to leverage resources and play a small part in big changes. Among the most courageous nonviolent movements of which I'm aware is WOZA, Women of Zimbabwe Arise, which had very little visibility and support when we first learned of them. These intrepid women have persistently challenged the oppressive policies of dictator Robert Mugabe. Despite beatings and arrests, including some of them being jailed with their babies, they continue to sound a clarion call for nonviolent change. Inspired by their courage, men in Zimbabwe have launched an auxiliary effort, MOZA, Men of Zimbabwe Arise. In 2009, WOZA, Women of Mugabe Arise, Women of Zimbabwe Arise, won the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Award, which President Barack Obama presented at the White House to Jenny Williams, the group's leader. She later described how Obama walked in, handed over the award, and left the room. A few minutes later, he came back in, explaining that he wasn't quite sure what he was allowed to do. He sat down and listened for more than an hour as the members of WOZA told their moving story. Peace Workers has also supported and provided nonviolent training for the Movimento de Trabalhadores Rurais Sem Terra, MST, the landless workers movement in Brazil, where 4.8 million farmers have no access to land. The largest social movement in Latin America, MST, has used nonviolent action to pressure the Brazilian government to give land titles to 150,000 families so far. The organization is supporting another 57,000 families occupying uncultivated land in 23 states, shoring up their hopes of receiving parcels to a farm. Diane Emerson, a friend doing relief work in Kashmir, a territory caught for more than 60 years in a violent dispute between India and Pakistan, invited peace workers to get involved in helping to end that tragic conflict. Diane was willing to donate 2 months of her salary to launch a nonviolent peacemaking project. I got her in touch with Rajiv Vora, who had been Asia regional coordinator of the Nonviolent Peace Force. Rajiv has enlisted the support of many Gandhians in India to become involved in this peacemaking effort, and nonviolent training is now being conducted in Kashmir with young people across religious and political divides. Peace Workers has partnered with Mustafa El-Hawi's Community Bridge Initiative in Gaza, offering some financial support. We've also been exploring the possibility of supporting the nonviolent struggle in Burma. I continue to talk with nonviolent activists around the world, helping them strategize and trying to meet expressed needs, such as nonviolence training, funding, accompaniment, and networking. I'm working with a colleague, Jan Passion, organizing the Rapid Nonviolent Accompaniment and Protection Project, RNAPP, an effort of peace workers that I find especially exciting. The project is designed for individuals who have had significant experience with peace team work in war zones. RNAPP is developing a roster of people available to go on short notice to volunteer in areas of conflict or extreme repression for up to 6 months, with the understanding that if a longer-term presence is needed, the Nonviolent Peace Force or another international peace team could follow. RNAPP is presently sending volunteers to accompany the villagers in the nonviolent movement on Jeju Island off the coast of South Korea, who are protesting the building of a new military base on their island by nonviolently blocking bulldozers and cement trucks. I've distributed thousands of copies of a documentary DVD called A Force More Powerful in many languages all over the world. It shares the stories of people engaged in significant nonviolent movements that have had success bringing fundamental change. These include India's independence struggle and South Africa's peaceful transition from apartheid to democracy, Denmark's nonviolent resistance to Nazi persecution of the Jews, and Poland's solidarity movement, the American Civil Rights Movement, and Chile's overthrow of the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet. I've also spread around copies of Bringing Down a Dictator, the story of the student-led nonviolent movement of massive nonviolent civil resistance that forced Serbian dictator Slobodan Milosevic out of power in 2000, and the Orange Revolution, which documents the extraordinary story of massive nonviolent demonstrations in Kiev, Ukraine, against the fraudulent 2004 election and the poisoning of opposition candidate Viktor Yushchenko, when 20,000 people camped out in front of the Capitol building for 2 weeks in 20 below zero weather until the election was declared null and void. I'm grateful to the International Center for Nonviolent Conflict, which has sent at their own expense thousands of copies of these excellent resources all over the world when I request them, a wonderful contribution to increasing global understanding of the power of nonviolent people's movements. I feel a bit like Johnny Appleseed, spreading the seeds of nonviolence and nurturing those seeds around the world. I'll never know where they all land, how they might take root, or what fruit they might produce. I've always appreciated a prayer, often attributed to Archbishop Oscar Romero of El Salvador, but written by Bishop Ken Unterner of Saginaw, Michigan, in honor of the Archbishop's martyrdom. It reads in part, "It helps now and then to step back and take a long view. We accomplish in our lifetime only a tiny fraction of the magnificent enterprise that is God's work. We plant the seeds that one day will grow. We water seeds already planted, knowing that they hold future promise. We cannot do everything, and there is a sense of liberation in realizing that. This enables us to do something, and to do it very well. It may be incomplete, but it is a beginning, a step along the way, an opportunity for the Lord's grace to enter and do the rest."